from Washington, D.C.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kriti Gupta in Washington, where we come to you with breaking news this evening. Conservative activist Charlie Kirk has been confirmed dead by the President of the United States. President Trump just a short time ago posting, quote, "The great and even legendary Charlie Kirk is dead," unquote. Kirk's death followed a shooting that took place just a short time ago.
Kirk was speaking at Utah Valley University when he was shot on stage. Prominent Republican Jason Chaffetz saying he only heard a single shot ring out, the shot that presumably struck and, according to the president, killed Kirk. Moments before the president confirmed his death, House Speaker Mike Johnson said this from Capitol Hill.
This is detestable, what's happened. Political violence has become all too common in American society, and this is not who we are. It violates the core principles of our country, our Judeo-Christian heritage, our civil society, our American way of life, and it must stop. We need every political figure, we need everyone who has a platform to say this loudly and clearly. We can settle disagreements and disputes in a civil manner, and political violence must be called out, and it has to stop.
This is a fast-moving story, and we have our reporters covering it with much more tonight. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan joins us from the White House, and Bloomberg's Mike Shepard is with us here in our Washington bureau. Shep, let's start with you right now as someone who's covered politics for a long time around here, and the element of political violence that has crept back into our culture over the past couple of years, something hard to ignore. With regard to this young man, someone who started a movement as a teenager and helped to lift Donald Trump into the White House, what do we make of this latest turn?
Well, this, as Joe, as you pointed out, really does point to this fear many have had about an increase in political violence. We've seen the rhetoric over the past decade or so really intensify and an edge creep into the conversation when it comes to, the core cultural and political and social and policy issues that surround daily life in the U.S. And we've seen flashes of this violence actually manifest itself. Of course, more than a year ago, then candidate Donald Trump himself was the target of 2 assassination attempts. The one, of course, in Butler, Pennsylvania, that was so high profile when he emerged to say, "Fight, fight, fight." But then more recently, in June of this year, we saw 2 Democratic lawmakers in Minnesota who were targeted in their homes at night by a gunman who was politically motivated, according to authorities there. So this is the kind of incident that stokes the concern that the rhetoric and the intensified back and forth between the various and quite divided sides here in this country can spill over into violence. And that's something that we just heard the House Speaker address moments ago.
Mike, I think I'm going to ask you the question that a lot of people around the country are asking, which is there a policy response and policy fallout that we can expect off the back of this?
Well, for the immediate moment, there will be calls for prayer for Charlie Kirk and for his family in the wake of this terrible incident, and calls from both sides really to step back from the brink of violence. But then the actual policy steps, that always gets more tricky. And sad to say, in many respects, it is to be expected that each side will fall back on the norm, with Democrats perhaps urging more control of firearms and access to firearms, and Republicans, pointing to questions about extremism on the left. And so when it comes to a policy prescription emerging from this, or from, for example, the incident in Minnesota just weeks ago, the school shooting at a Catholic school in Minnesota, it is more of the same that we're likely to hear on this. And really the whole issue, Kriti, is the question of political rhetoric and people now willing to take that next step and follow on their worst instincts and urges, as we have seen fomented and promoted on social media for several years now.
Bloomberg's Mike Shepard, we thank you so much for bringing us up to speed. I want to go to Kate Sullivan, who's at the White House for us. Kate, just bring us up to speed on the reaction where you are.
So we're seeing an outpouring of messages of prayer and condolences from across the White House and the broader Trump administration. The president called Charlie Kirk legendary. He said, "Nobody understood or had the heart of the youth in the United States of America better than Charlie." Charlie Kirk was a fixture on the campaign trail. I saw him at countless events across many different battleground states. When I was covering the Trump campaign last year, the president has credited him with really boosting his his turnout among young people and getting young people excited about his campaign. Charlie Kirk founded Turning Point USA, which specifically advocates for conservative politics on high school and college campuses. So we saw Charlie Kirk host many, many events across college campuses, particularly during the campaign season. Before news came out that he had actually died, J.D. Vance posted 3 different times on social media, posting a photo of himself and Kirk, saying Kirk would answer any question and talk to everyone. So you're seeing, the close ties that Kirk has with many people in the White House, many different Republican officials. We're all just reacting to this horrific news right now.
Somewhat unusual to have this announcement come from the President of the United States himself. Kate, is the press office or communications office saying anything about the fact that the commander-in-chief told us this, as opposed to Kirk's family?
No, and that's a great point and question. All we know is what Trump has posted, and we're seeing, after he posted, then J.D. Vance posted, and so a lot of people are, of course, taking cues from the president and reacting to this news that, as you're completely correct, that Trump broke on Truth Social himself.
Do we expect the president to speak about this, or is the Truth Social post going to speak for the president this evening?
As of, unless he has posted something in the last few seconds, we have not heard of any firm plans. Nothing scheduled at the moment. On his schedule, there was a Rose Garden event in the Rose Garden Club. It's unclear whether that is going to move forward. And so I think things are still trying to figure out what the schedule is tonight and moving forward, and what more the president might say about this.
Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan at the White House. Kate, thank you as always. We just heard from the president again on social media. He was typing while we were talking. In honor of Charlie Kirk, he writes, "A truly great American patriot. I am ordering all American flags throughout the United States lowered to half-mast until Sunday evening at 6 p.m. Coming up, we're going to return to the major developing story tonight in Washington, the latest provocation from Russia now rattling European partners. But first, our political panel is with us here in studio. Kristen Hawn, our Democratic strategist, partner at Rokk Solutions, joins us alongside Maura Gillespie, Bluestack Strategies. It's great to see both of you. A Republican strategist, I'll start with you in this case, Maura. Talk to us about the significance of what this means for the Republican movement, if not the MAGA movement, and why the White House is so deeply involved. Why did we learn this from the president?
Well, I think it's no surprise the president feels pretty strongly about his loyalists, those who have been his champions. And I think that the biggest takeaway for me is to say that this isn't about being Republican. This isn't about being Democrat. This is about political violence in this country and why it's so prevalent here. That's a problem. And I don't know how we screen for it. I don't know how you can't really necessarily see hate in someone's heart. And so we have a bigger conversation to have here, because this is a man, whether you agreed with him or not, or vehemently disagreed with him, this is a husband, a father, someone's son. And I just think that we have lost sight of really our humanity when it comes to our political discourse in this country, whether it was from Gabby Giffords to Steve Scalise to what happened in Minnesota, to the president himself, and to watch this now. And for anyone who's been on social media and those videos are playing, whether you wanted to see it or not, it is truly, I mean, I'm sitting here, I'm sure you're all feeling the same, but sick to my stomach about what this means, but also just seeing it. But we have to get a handle on it, and I don't know what that answer is, but it's not Republican or Democrat. It is us as Americans, and we have a problem here.
Kristen, just weigh in, your immediate reaction.
I mean, obviously, I totally agree. This is not a one-party problem or the other, as we've clearly seen throughout the years. And, I was on Capitol Hill working for the Blue Dog Coalition, of which Congresswoman Giffords was a member. And, you're a communications person trying to write statements. And I remember just breaking down crying and then trying to gather myself and pull myself together. I think an element, it's hard to figure out exactly how to get at this, but an element is the rhetoric that's coming out of, both sides of the aisle sometimes, and toning that down, treating people like humans, and your leaders. And it starts with the President of the United States. People listen to what he's saying. And, and members of Congress and members of the Senate. And having an honest dialogue that's civil with, your next door neighbor, I think, is really important. I don't think that maybe fixes everything because, like you said, you can't see hate in somebody's heart. You can't necessarily tell what they're going to do. But, it can definitely start there.
Maura reminds us of the Steve Scalise shooting that was years ago. The Capitol Police shooting was, 1999? This has been a conversation in Washington for years, and whether we should provide more security for lawmakers who in many cases are dipping into allowances to find private security and protection for themselves. You worked for a former speaker in John Boehner. Maura, does that need to happen?
I think it's a conversation to be had about how much members make currently. I know that that's not necessarily a popular conversation, but when you look at their salary, if they are, in a situation where they need to get security, their salary is not really going to cover that, plus their housing here in D.C. So you think about that, that may be a conversation to have, some built-in funding for security needs. But I think with Kristen's point there about talking and how we use our words, referring to our political opponents as enemies, that's a problem, right? We can do better. And I think that for every member of Congress, anyone who's running for office, and anyone who sits, talking on politics on TV should try and do better and make a promise to try and do that, because I think that our words have impact, and how we talk to one another as a Republican talking to a Democrat and be on a panel together. That makes, I do think that people at home watch that, and how we handle our discourse here really could make an impact at home.
Well, and as far as the security needs go, just look at the members of the January 6th committee. They started getting, they didn't have Secret Service or Capitol Police security 24/7 until they all started getting death threats, a lot of them on both sides of the aisle, and people were going to their houses at home when they were here in Washington, D.C., and going to their kids' schools. And so, we afforded them the protection of the Capitol Police, who do such a wonderful job at protecting our officials. But, this is all members of Congress. I think, the move to give them a little bit of money to, out of their current allotment to provide some of that security for themselves and their family was probably a good thing.
The result is, unfortunately, fewer people wanting to run for elected office when we're having conversations like these. Our political panel is going to stay with us. Kristen, Hawn, and Maura Gillespie, thank you so much for the immediate response now as we turn to Capitol Hill. Joining us now live from the Capitol, Republican Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator, it's good to have you here. It's not what we expected that we would be talking about this evening, but can you weigh in on this, your reaction to what took place, how we got here, and whether we need to have a serious conversation about Capitol Police security for lawmakers like yourself?
Well, let me begin just by offering my condolences, my thoughts, my prayers to Charlie's family, to his spouse, and to their children. This is not something that any of us on either side of any political aisle want to see happen ever. And so this is simply very, very unfortunate, and we offer our thoughts and our prayers. And, look, this is just a bad message from what we would hope otherwise would have been an opportunity for peaceful discussion on specific issues, talking about, our differences in a very, very normal way, a way in which people can have a discussion, having differences, having differing points of view, and still remaining as friends and as colleagues. And so to see Charlie Kirk in this particular method, this is just a terrible, terrible day for America. And once again, it is something that I think, with regard to what we do here in the capital of the United States and the way that we treat one another, is something that should be an example that you don't have to have violence in the middle of political discussions.
Senator Rounds, do we need to hear from the president in a call for unity to end some of this political violence? Is that what we're waiting for?
I think the first thing that the president did was to offer his thoughts, his prayers, his condolences to Charlie's family. I think that's, the first thing that we all want to do. And then along with that, it is an opportunity for us to once again tell the rest of America and the rest of the world that we can have differing points of view and not be violent about it. And so anything that any of us can do to offer as an example the way that we should treat one another with respect, that's a positive thing. I think that's what Charlie Kirk would have wanted to have had happen. And most certainly that's something that I think we should continue to carry on, which is peacefully discuss, have your differing points of view, argue it, debate it. It's healthy for America, but our founding fathers wanted that to be done in such a fashion that we could still be one strong, unified nation, even if we have differing points of view. And there's nothing wrong with having differing points of view.
Well, I appreciate your point of view on that, Senator. We were looking at some polling from Ipsos from back in July that asked voters about political extremism and threats to our democracy. This poll with Reuters showed 27% of Americans ranked political extremism as the most important problem facing the U.S. How about you?
I can just tell you from personal experience here in Washington, we work across some of the most polarized areas in terms of ideas and ideologies. But if you talk to members of the Senate, Republican and Democrat alike, we get along with one another. We have visits with one another. We go to lunch together. We have a prayer breakfast together. We have Bible studies together. We are not enemies. We may have differing points of view, but that doesn't get across very often. And so the example that we should be able to offer is one of unity in terms of making America better than what it is today. Our founding fathers said that they wanted to create a more perfect union. They didn't say our union was perfect to begin with. They wanted it more perfect. Well, that's what we should be focused on here. And sometimes in the middle of our strong emotions here, we forget to finish with that particular part of the message, which is regardless of our points of view, we're Americans first. And we treat each other with respect and with dignity. And here in the Capitol, in the offices that we have, I can tell you personally and that behind closed doors, Republicans and Democrats alike get along. We respect one another. We consider each other as colleagues and friends. And we would hope that across America, whether it's a coffee clutch or whether it's a political meeting, a city council meeting, or a state legislative body, that we remember that we are all Americans and that we have a whole lot more in common than we'll ever disagree on.
Senator Rounds, I want to return to a subject that we were planning on discussing with you ahead of today's tragedy. And that, of course, is what's going on when it comes to Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, with Russian drones being shot down by NATO forces. Senator Rounds, in your perspective, is Vladimir Putin opening up another front of the war in Ukraine?
I'm not sure whether, and once again, it'll take time to work its way through the intel agencies and to do the background on it. I'm not sure whether it was intentional that they were trying to get across Poland, or if they simply lost their way because of the lack of appropriate navigational aids. But I can tell you that one of the options out there is his disdain for Europe and his challenging, once again, of America, and about his desire to send a message that he really doesn't care what we think. And that's scary, because when you have someone who wants to recreate the former Soviet Union, if he thinks that we're not going to impose economic damages on Russia, then he's got another thing coming, because we're getting closer and closer to the point where we can really disrupt his economy with additional sanctions secondarily put in place on places like India, who we want to be our friend and ally, and China, who is clearly our adversary today. And the fact that he would challenge or intentionally push the issues with our NATO allies, that's very disconcerting to us, and it's something that we've got to be very much aware as a possibility.
Well, I'm sure you're talking about secondary sanctions and other measures with all of your colleagues on the Armed Services Committee, Senator. How far does Vladimir Putin need to push that line to trigger these sanctions? We've been talking about it for months.
I think part of that will be up to President Trump. And here's the reason why. We're prepared to do it, but we want to do it in concert with the White House. We want to give the president the opportunity, as much as he can, to be able to negotiate with Mr. Putin. But the reality is that time is getting short. I think the president probably recognizes that. He's expressed his frustration, but clearly Mr. Putin has been recalcitrant in his efforts to, number one, go after Ukraine. It's like many of us have said from day one, every once in a while when you have a bully, the only way that you can deal with a bully is to punch him in the nose. And it may very well be time to economically punch Mr. Putin in the nose a lot harder than he's been punched in the past. And once again, we'll coordinate with the White House. The president is the leader on this, but we're going to be able to provide with him the tools that he believes necessary. And these sanctions are something that we would be able to move forth fairly quickly with regard to secondary sanctions on some of the people that are buying his oil and petroleum products.
Senator Rounds, we've seen that play out with India, and you mentioned it in passing in terms of secondary sanctions, in terms of targeting the funding for Putin's war machine. But in the fallout of that, at least from the imagery of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it felt like that move pushed India closer towards Russia, closer towards China. Is there a risk here that in allowing those secondary sanctions, the United States would be alienating members of the global South?
Yes, that is a possibility, and that may very well be one of the reasons why we have not gone to the next step with regard to actually passing specific legislation to allow for that to happen. And so it's of concern. Look, we don't want to alienate India, but if they are going to be a facilitator to Russia in his attempt to reestablish the former Soviet Union, then it's probably time to send as powerful a message as we can to India that this is simply not acceptable, and that there are certain steps that if they take them, there will be consequences. And that's not something that we want to do, but when we're pushed in that direction, economic sanctions is probably a better step forward than an immediate move to military involvement.
Senator, it's great to have you, and I appreciate your candor in talking about this very sensitive issue, because I've been in that rotunda and I have seen Republican members like yourself get along quite well with Democrats, and I wish more people saw that side of the Capitol. Mike Rounds of South Dakota, thank you for being with us on Balance of Power. Joining us now to get back to this more with this evening's political panel for a couple of moments, Kristen Hawn, partner at Rokk Solutions, our Democratic strategist, alongside Republican strategist Maura Gillespie, founder, principal, Bluestack Strategies. Maura, he sounded a lot like you just now, didn't he?
He did. And I was honestly really, really pleased to hear the tone that he took, but also to remind people what happens behind closed doors. As you mentioned, right. Working in the Capitol and seeing members, yes, they'll be at their podiums and debating a bill, but then they'll walk up the aisle of the House floor or the Senate floor and say, you know, how'd you shoot this weekend on your round of golf? That's and right. they'll have conversations like human beings. And I think that in this moment, Senator Rounds pointed out that he wanted more people to know about that.
Yes.
And we should have more people know about that. They should know that the members themselves don't hate each other. They just disagree. But as my old boss, John Boehner, would say, you can disagree without being disagreeable. And his door was always open. Yeah. And it was one of my favorite things about it was seeing members who would come back just to have a talk with him, maybe smoke a cigarette. But, you know, they
never saw that. Huh?
Never saw that, but rumors. But it just, this idea that we can disagree without being disagreeable shouldn't be so foreign. It should be the norm. And I was really pleased to hear Senator Rounds reiterate that today.
Kristen, what's going on through Democrats' minds right now? Is this expected to have a unifying effect as these pouring of well wishes come out, or a divisive one at the end of the day?
I don't think it will be divisive. It was interesting. My ears perked up when I heard Senator Rounds. It was great to hear what he was saying, and it struck me when he said, behind closed doors, we don't hate each other. Behind closed doors, we do all these things together, and I've had the same experience, and same thing with staff across the aisle. I think we could do a little bit more of that outside of closed doors. Do a little bit more of that at the podium. There are some pretty visceral fights that people are having, and they get personal, and then you can't have all those discussions just behind closed doors. I think this is something that has happened to all of us, and it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or Democrat, so of course it's unifying. Of course people are, terribly saddened by what's happened today, and it shouldn't happen. But, I think the policy debates are going to move forward, and those won't necessarily change where people stand, on the actual legislation.
I'm sure that is true. Though we're talking in this case largely in our conversation here and with a lawmaker, we're looking at this with regard to Congress. This was not an elected official. And I wonder to what extent this feels like a new level to go outside of official elected politics to attack a thinker who you don't agree with.
I do. I wonder what this, again, like I said before, you can't necessarily see what's in someone's heart, so you don't know what's,
sure.
Factors there. But what Charlie Kirk was doing, whether you agree with him or vehemently disagree with him, he was opening up conversation, welcomed debate, and welcomed different thinkers and different
Gavin
opinions.
Newsom had welcomed on his show.
That's right.
And exactly. And
he was doing it on college campuses with young people. On college
campuses, getting young people to realize that this debating is a skill that we all should be, equipped to have, but should be open to listening to other people's opinions. How else can you decide how you feel about something if you're not willing to hear the other side? And I think I think it's why it's hitting even harder that whether you agree with him or not, he opened up conversation and allowed for conversation and welcomed it. And to your question about what does this mean for people who are having speeches or just going to talk to college campuses, what is the security level going to be like now? And what does that mean for us as Americans? The land of the free, now we have barriers to that because people are going to be afraid.
Right, yeah. There were multiple barriers in front of that stage this evening, we should know. We're going to have much more reaction to this story in the big news regarding Russia when ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, Senator Jeanne Shaheen, joins us. More of our panel ahead as well on Balance of Power. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kriti Gupta in Washington, where we're following breaking news out of Utah, where conservative commentator Charlie Kirk has died, as confirmed by the President of the United States. We got a statement a short time ago from the Democratic leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, that we'll have for you here if you're with us on Bloomberg TV. He writes, I am shocked by the murder of Charlie Kirk at Utah Valley University. Political violence of any kind and against any individual is unacceptable and completely incompatible with American values. We pray for his family during this tragedy. One of many responses coming from Washington, D.C. Joining us with more now is Bloomberg's Mike Shepard. Mike, this is a story that continues to evolve before our eyes. There's going to be an outpouring of commentary like this. Will it mean anything with regard to policy? And should the president speak this evening?
Well, we are waiting to see whether the president emerges from the White House to discuss this in person. We have heard from him several times already since news first emerged that Charlie Kirk had been shot. At first, the president was calling for prayers on behalf of Kirk and his family, and Donald Trump was the first to announce officially Kirk's death in a message on social media to the nation. And he later followed up with a call for all flags across the country, including at the White House, to be lowered to half staff in Kirk's honor. Now, what will the president be calling for? We have heard Mike Johnson and other lawmakers and President Joe Biden. This is really a bipartisan view that the temperature when it comes to politics and debate in this country needs to be lowered so that it doesn't cross the line into violence, something that we have seen. Of course, the president himself having been the target of not one but two assassination attempts during his comeback bid for the White House last year, and then more recently, the assassination of a Minnesota lawmaker and his wife in their home, and the shooting of another Minnesota lawmaker in their home in a politically motivated attack. So this whole question of political violence is very much on the minds of politicians on all sides of the aisle, no matter their points of view, Joe.
Bloomberg's Mike Shepard, thank you so much for bringing us the latest on the tragedy earlier today. I want to bring in another voice. Joining us now, Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, joins the program. Senator, thank you so much for your time this evening. I'd like to ask you about your initial reaction to the tragedy earlier today.
Sadness, sympathy for the family of Charlie Kirk and all of those friends and supporters. I had a chance to meet with some people who had worked very closely with him after we got news of the shooting, and they were visibly shaken by the news. Political violence, as you've said, is not acceptable, and we've got to do everything we can as public officials to respect each other, to listen to voices, and to condemn this kind of violence when it occurs.
Well, Senator, there are questions Of course, about security that we have revisited a lot of times over the past couple of years. We just asked your colleague, Senator Mike Rounds, if it is time to have a more serious conversation about security details for members of Congress. This was not an elected official in this case, but there are great concerns about copycat. There are great concerns about lone wolves, and of course, the series of threats that you've all been hearing in the House and the Senate. What is your thought tonight?
Well, the Congress has taken some steps in the last few years to look at security on the part of members. I know a number of my colleagues who have had security assessments done of the places where they live, and they feel better because of that. So I think we've got to take appropriate steps. And again, I think we have to condemn this kind of violence, this kind of political violence, and remind people that we're all Americans. While we may disagree on some issues, we've got to listen to each other, respect each other, and never allow this kind of violence to occur.
Senator, I'd like to talk about some other news from earlier today, especially from your perch on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There have been reports, several reports, that Russia had drones when it came to Polish airspace, something that triggered not only some of them getting shot down by NATO members, but also ultimately Poland triggering Article 4 consultations when it comes to some sort of military escalation. Just walk us through your understanding of the conflict and where it may go from here.
Well, it is a dangerous step and escalation to have that kind of fallout of a NATO country. Poland has been raising concerns since the war in Ukraine began about Vladimir Putin and Russia's intent, not only in Ukraine, but against other NATO countries. We hear it from not just Poland, but from the Baltic countries about what the ramifications are and the fallout from the war in Ukraine. And we've seen it very dramatically in the last couple of days with respect to what's happened in Poland. So I think it's very appropriate that the Poles have invoked Article 4 and are asking to meet with other NATO allies about how to respond to this kind of inappropriate, just very bad attack from Russia. And even though they claim they're not aiming the attacks against Poland, the reality is because of what they're doing in Ukraine, because of their war against Ukraine, it's having an impact on the countries that neighbor Ukraine.
Well, considering your history with foreign policy, Senator, just the fact that we're having a conversation about Article 4 has got to have your antennas up. What more needs to happen before secondary sanctions are triggered?
Well, I think we should trigger secondary sanctions now. I think there are over 80 members of Congress who support the Graham-Blumenthal legislation, and I would hope we can bring it to the floor.
Senator, there is a question here that this has happened just days after reports of Americans pulling the United States of America pulling funding, security funding from Eastern European countries. Does the United States here need to have a show of force as the Europeans ramp up their defense? What's the U.S.'s role right now?
I think one of the real important measures that the United States has taken in the last few years with NATO has been to put additional troops on what we call the eastern flank, so the eastern border of Eastern European countries that border Russia. It's important for stability. It sends a strong message about what the intent of NATO is in protecting those countries who are members of NATO, and it sends a message to Russia that we are there, we are on the border. I think there is bipartisan support in Congress to continue those troop deployments, and we should be very clear that we are standing strong as an alliance against the kind of action that Russia is taking in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. There are big questions about whether the government's going to be open on the 1st of October, Senator, and I don't know if you're hearing anything that you can help us find an answer here, because I understand that Democrats and Republicans are really not talking at this time. But if you do get to the table, there's the thought, and I know that John Thune doesn't seem very open to this right now, but there's a thought that extending Obamacare tax credits might be enough to get Democrats and Republicans on the same page with at least a continuing resolution to avoid a shutdown. Is that how this movie ends? Or are we really going to go dark at the end of the month?
Well, in fact, Democrats and Republicans are talking. We are talking. I serve as the ranking member on the Ag Appropriations Subcommittee. We have passed that bill from the floor of the Senate, and we are now going to conference with our House members to move that bill forward, and we're doing the same thing in the other bills that have passed the Senate. So I think it's premature to say that we're not going to continue to talk. We're not going to continue to move the appropriations process forward. Obviously, we're not going to get it all done by October 1st, so we're going to have to look at a continuing resolution for some period of time. And I hope as part of these discussions, we're going to look at the impact of the rollback in premium tax credits on people's health care in this country. Because what we know is that when people lose those tax credits, which help them afford health insurance, often they lose their health insurance. We have millions of people whose costs are going to go up because of the expiration of the tax credits. And we have, in New Hampshire alone, we have over 45,000 people who are expected to lose their health insurance. And what we've heard from the Georgetown University Center for Health Insurance Reform, from a study that we requested that they do, is the people who are going to be most affected by this are those who live in rural areas, working families, older Americans, the people who can, small business owners, the people who can least afford those cost increases.
Senator, thank you for joining us. Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire. It's great to have you back on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio as we turn to another major story. A cooler than expected PPI report, wholesale inflation, fueling interest rate bets now as we get a somewhat clearer picture of who will also be voting on that decision next week. This morning, the Senate Banking Committee voting along party lines to back the nomination of Trump advisor Stephen Miron to a short-term post as a Federal Reserve governor. Assuming this clears the floor, he'll be in for a 4.5-month-long term, and sources tell Bloomberg that a full Senate vote on his confirmation could come as early as Monday. Also, late last night, a U.S. district judge ruling the president likely did not have cause to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook and cannot fire her now, at least for now. The Justice Department has already appealed that ruling, and joining us with more, Bloomberg's Michael McKee. We do have a sense, though, Michael, I'm assuming this appeal, even filed today, wouldn't change the status of next week's meeting, or could it?
Well, it could, but there isn't a lot of time for the government to get a case before the appeals court and for the appeals court to make a decision. This could be considered an emergency by the administration, although it's a little harder to see an emergency that would force her out of a particular meeting. The court could decide within the next week or so, and it wouldn't make a whole lot of difference one way or another. However, we're waiting for the final filing before the court by the administration's lawyers, the Department of Justice, to find out exactly what they're going to ask for. But one presumes they're asking for a stay of the temporary injunction that Judge Cobb gave that would enable Lisa Cook to stay in her role as a Federal Reserve governor while all this is litigated.
Mike, we also got some data out today on the economic front. The PPI numbers came out. In the last data set, they came out much stronger than expected, and everyone pointed to the fact that this might be the first signs of a tariff read-through. Today, getting a negative month-on-month print. What do you make of the data we got today?
Well, this is a case where you really have to go under the hood and understand how this PPI is put together. We did see some categories like electronic components, furniture, things like that, that are tariffed, go up in price. But what really depressed the PPI overall was a drop in what they call trade services. But trade services measure wholesaler and retailer margins, profit margins. So if they dropped, wholesalers and retailers were losing margin share, and that suggests they were absorbing some of the tariffs. It was primarily on the wholesale side, which suggests that some of that then will show up in retail prices either in the CPI tomorrow or next month as those costs get passed along.
Well, Mike, how does this show up ultimately when it comes to the PCE data? And does the Fed, at least in about a week's time, care about the numbers we got on the PPI front today?
Well, the Fed cares in the sense that it gives them some idea of what may be coming in. For example, we saw some fruits and vegetables rising in price, food prices going up. That's obviously going to have a public relations effect as people go to the grocery store. But they'll be watching the CPI much more closely to get a read on how this is affecting the overall economy and the average consumer, because what they don't want is for consumers to start changing their buying habits because they're afraid inflation is coming and things will be more expensive tomorrow. That's the issue for the Fed. They're going to cut rates 25 basis points unless we get a surprise tomorrow. The PPI, although it had some tricky parts to it, not enough to dissuade them. But then the question becomes, after CPI, do they then give us a roadmap for what they do next? Do they raise rates, cut rates again, rather, in October and December? What's the roadmap ahead? What's the dot plot going to say?
Bloomberg's Michael McKee. We thank you, Mike, as always. Still much more up ahead on Balance of Power as we reconvene our political panel. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kriti Gupta in Washington. Short time ago, the president issued a formal declaration on the death of Charlie Kirk. The White House lowering flags at half-staff in remembrance of Kirk. As the president, in his declaration, said, as a mark of respect for the memory of Charlie Kirk by the authority vested in me, as President of the United States by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, I hereby order the flag of the U.S. shall be flown at half-staff. Back with us, our political panel, Kristen, Hawn, partner at Rokk Solutions, our Democratic strategist, alongside Republican strategist Maura, Gillespie, founder and principal at Bluestack Strategies. I'm sure that you'll both have more thoughts on this story with Charlie Kirk today. I'd like to get to some of the policy that we discussed with our lawmakers this hour as we start to straddle the line here on a potential government shutdown. The Republican leader in the Senate, John Thune, told reporters that he does not like this idea of extending Obamacare subsidies beyond the end of the year. That was supposed to unlock a deal with Democrats. Do you take him at his word there? Is there any chance this could move? And is there another issue lawmakers can find common ground on?
They've got to find something, because while Democrats can certainly play, okay, we're going to go into a shutdown, there has to be a plan to get out of it. Mm-hmm. And without a plan, the blame will go to them after a certain amount of time. If they just go into the shutdown without a plan, that's a problem. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be some sort of a conversation that's happening where they feel as though they could work on finding a common ground with Thune and with Senate Republicans. If it's not the Obamacare credits, then they have to find something else. But Republicans also can't be naive enough to think that they can have everything they want and Democrats will just simply jump on board and play along. There has to be, again, negotiations, conversations, and a willingness to concede on some issues.
Mm-hmm. Kristen, if not the credits, then what?
I think I agree that there need to be honest conversations that have to start in the Senate, because it won't happen in the House, and unfortunately. But they have to be honest, and they have to bring the Democrats to the table and not just give them what they think they want and then demand their votes. And then when they don't give them their votes, go out all over television, and they will on your show too, and say it's Democrats' fault that we are shutting down the government. They are in control of every single part of it. They're in control of the White House, the House, and the Senate. And so, like Maura said, you can't just dictate to them exactly what they're looking for. I mean, there are members like Senator Klobuchar in the Senate who are honest brokers who want to come to the table and talk about, what it would take to get people, because believe me, Democrats don't want to see the government shut down. They want to see government work. You've seen this year after year after year after year for 20 years, right? They're always the ones, when Republicans are in control, to come to the table and do the right thing to make sure the people won't hurt and the government continues to stay open. So I think honest dialogue and honest, actual conversation between the two parties is what needs to happen.
Well, you're channeling Chuck Schumer. He spoke.
No.
Is that a problem? He's not going to do it again what he did in March, I don't think. Is that a problem? You're not channeling John Thune. Listen to what the Democratic leader in the Senate said earlier today.
For weeks now, Leader Jeffries and I have been asking Leader Thune and Speaker Johnson to meet with us to start negotiating, keep the government funding. We've heard nothing, crickets. As Senator Murray can tell you, the only way to avoid a shutdown is to work in a bipartisan way. And that's what we are trying to do. But Republicans are once again threatening to go at it alone, which will lead our country straight into a shutdown, a Republican-caused shutdown, because they refuse to work together.
Is he not laying the groundwork as you just were?
I think he's laying the groundwork. There's the messaging and then there's the policy. Okay. And this might be one of those places where sometimes they coincide with each other. But I mean, I think at the end of the day, I'll say I was speaking from like an earnest policy standpoint.
Oh, boy.
Even though I come at it from a communications perspective, that,
say it out loud,
that you
Kristen,
have to have, like, we're talking about those conversations they're having behind closed doors, and it has to be an honest discussion. And then you have to go back to the House, and then you have to talk to. I mean, that was a whole breakdown last time, right? And on the Democratic side between the House and the Senate, and the leadership on both sides. So probably more on the Senate leadership side than on the House leadership side. On the Democrats' part, but at the end of the day, the Republicans have to.
Well, and I think that's where the honest conversations come in, right? I think that Mike Johnson has to have an honest conversation with his members and with their supporters, right? They need to understand that just because, as Kristen pointed out, we have all three, branches. We have all the power of Congress and the president, but we still need Democrats' votes. So we still need Democrat votes, and that's why we need to compromise and find common ground and get something that can actually pass, because we do need some Democrats on board. So I think it's important to remember and also to remind our constituents that just because we have all the power doesn't mean we can get everything we want done without any input from the Democrats. That's just not how this works. Yeah. So I think it's a little civics-friendly reminder. It would be helpful.
I appreciate that always. Little schoolhouse rock.
Yes.
Maura, what happened to the narrative that the Republicans actually want to shut down the government?
That narrative? What are you talking about?
Republicans or the White House?
We never want to shut down.
Doesn't Russ Vought want to shut down the government?
I mean, I do think that the president enjoys the idea of shut down, and then shifting the blame to Democrats. It's a winning message in his view. But again, back to this idea of having civil discourse and understanding how government works, it's very important to remind constituents that in order to get something done, you have to have buy-in from the other side. Our founding fathers did not design our system of government so that one party could just have their way all the time. That's just not how it was created. And so it's very, again, it just feels very elementary, but it does bear repeating that this is how this needs to work, through conversation, through negotiation, and honest brokers.
Well, let's embrace civil discourse in our remaining couple of moments, because we started the program here and spent a lot of time this hour talking about a terrible tragedy. If you're just joining us, Charlie Kirk has died. He was shot at an event today in Utah. What should we be thinking overnight and when we wake up tomorrow, when we go back to work in Washington?
I think, sadly, it's a reminder that we're all human and that we need to come together and we need to have civil conversations around things like not as simple as funding the government. And it gets so visceral and so mean. And what people are putting out there, on social media, I mean, it's and the algorithms and what they're sending to us. We're seeing the worst of humanity, and reminding each other that your neighbor is doing nice things for other people. The majority of people are good, and I think maybe no offense, but stop watching cable news for a night and watch a comedy show, watch Friends for the night, and remind each other that we're, and come to the table tomorrow with maybe a fresh way of thinking in this really sad moment.
Well, we try to transcend cable news to the extent that we can here on Bloomberg Television. Of course, we're talking about the markets most of the time, and we bring in people like yourselves who can have a civil exchange. Maura, does the president need to speak tomorrow? We have about a minute left.
I would hope that he sets the tone for this dial down of the temperature, yes, but also in how we talk about one another. Not only how we talk to one another, but how we talk about one another, especially those we disagree with. Because the fact that somebody like Charlie Kirk was shot and killed for his political views, not for what he was doing there at that school, opening up a dialogue. He was shot and killed. We don't know the full, reasonings behind it, but presumably if he was attacked because of his views, that is a problem. Yeah. For anyone who goes on and talks about how they feel about something, that's a problem. And I'll just speak to camera very quickly. If you're somebody who's going on social media to share hate and to threaten somebody because you don't like their views, really take a look and think about what you're doing. Think about your families, your children, your neighbors, your loved ones.
Thank you, Maura. Maura, Gillespie, Kristen, Hawn, you've both been great. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.